Buckle up, kids, this one's gonna get bumpy. The Nintendo Switch 2 sees a massive drop-off in sales this week as compared to last week. This is of course in reference to the Japanese sales data, as that's the one that gets updated every single week and usually used as a reference point for a lot of people around the world. Remember early on when the Switch 2 launched and people kept mentioning how well it was doing? Well, for the most part, they were looking at Famitsu sales. But now that everything is slowing down, fewer and fewer people are talking about it every week. Last week's sales numbers were 20% lower than the week before. This week's Switch 2 sales numbers are roughly 47% lower than last week's. There are two big things here, however, that we can analyze. Number one, why is this drop-off happening and is it to be expected? And number two, how are people reacting to this drop-off? Because I think both of those things tell a pretty good story about the current state of Nintendo and its fandom. First off, the why. Well, it's an argument that I myself and many others have been making since the very beginning. The entirety of the launch of the Switch 2, those massive numbers, that amazing record-breaking, sales-shattering launch that we saw, was nothing more than a game of stockpiling. A game of delaying the Switch 2's launch. Let me explain it to you this way. Imagine there are 10 million Switch 2s sold from now until the end of the year, or rather from last month at launch until the end of the year. That's a pretty good number, right? I think there are a lot of people that assume that it's going in that direction. I don't know if I'm necessarily one of them. We'll have to wait until we get some official 1 month numbers in. Because obviously those 5 million units that were sold in 1 month was not a true number. It was a placeholder value put in there weeks before the 1 month even finished. So we still don't know what the 1 month Switch 2 sales numbers are. That being said, on July 23rd, we are getting some Circana numbers, so we'll actually have the data for the United States as far as retail sales go for that first month. Now, back to the discussion. 10 million Switch 2 sold from the launch until the end of the year. That's over a span of 7 months. If in fact they did sell 5 million in that first month alone, that sounds amazing, right? They got 5 million in month 1. The whole world must want this console. They must have unlimited stock available. But that means by the end of the year, if they only hit 10 million, that means they only sold another 5 million units over the span of the next 6 months. Now, 10 million is still 10 million, but when you stockpile and you have a top-heavy launch, it paints a prettier picture for people, and they start saying stuff like it's the fastest-selling console. Whereas in actuality, if this console was selling 1.4-ish units per month for a span of 7 months, that's equally as impressive as having 10 million units sold, with 5 million being in the first month. Are you understanding what I am saying here? The massive drop-off in numbers for the Switch 2, like many experts have been suggesting from the get-go, is because they were able to stockpile an extra amount of Switch 2s available by delaying the launch in order to make it look like they broke records. It's all just a charade. Because if they didn't stockpile, they probably after 2 or 3 months would hit the same amount of sales sold as they did with stockpiling. The difference is they were able to paint this picture that they had the world's record-breaking launch, which they did. Many consoles have excellent launches. The Wii U had an excellent launch. The Dreamcast had an excellent launch. It doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. But what it does mean is that by artificially padding the numbers by stockpiling for that initial launch weekend, the numbers are going to drastically downward spiral going forward. And that's not to say that this thing is going to fail. That's not what I'm implying. I'm just saying maybe it's time to curb your expectations a little bit. But for me, the funniest part of all this is the reactions. But not only the reactions, it's the way the goalposts are just frequently moving further and further along. Now, a lot of people think that the conversation is over. They just accepted the Switch 2 is the best-selling thing in the world, and let's stop talking about it. Who cares? But as somebody that has been following along with this very closely since the day that the Switch 2 Direct happened, you know I can't just let this go. This is a long discussion that's going to continue for months. And I'd like to make sure I keep tabs every step of the way, whether that means the Switch 2 randomly pulls out 3 million units sold tomorrow, or Nintendo casually goes bankrupt. But what I've noticed from the Nintendo community over the course of the past few weeks, 6-ish weeks to be exact, were unrealistically high expectations for an opening launch weekend, with people assuming that it would hit at least 5 million sold in that first weekend alone, but those expectations were naturally not met, and it still had great numbers, but not as high as many of them expected. And then I saw when the huge drop-off happened over the next week or two, they all said it's to be expected because the opening weekend was so high and you're always going to get a huge drop-off, even though the drop-off for the Switch 2 was higher than previous consoles. And then when they saw it drop off again, they started to discuss how much better that the Switch 1 was doing compared to the PS5, and the Switch 2 was still in a very healthy position. The following week, the number went upwards just a little bit, and that made people celebrate and rejoice because this thing is going to just continue to skyrocket upwards and break even more records. Which meant the following week, when it had a 20% drop off, which was its lowest performing week at the time, the narrative became, how long do you think they can hold this 100,000 units plus sold every week? That was their moved goalpost. And the estimates were hilarious. People assuming it was going to last for months. People assuming that Nintendo had a very healthy thing going and they were just going to continue selling hundreds of thousands of units every single week for the rest of their life. And then 1 week later brings us today, where the numbers show that the Switch 2 has dropped down to below 100,000 units by a long margin at 71,885 units sold last week. That is a huge drop off by any metric this early on in the console's life. Look up the previous ones and check out their weekly sales over the first few weeks. The Switch 2 sold only 7.5% this week what it did on its opening launch week. That's massive, and of course it's to be expected, and it's why people from the beginning have been saying that early launch number is not something to go by. It's not something that's sustainable. And now that that number is so steep, the narrative shifts once again. You know what's doing great right now? The Switch 1 in comparison to the PS5 in Japan, even though it's handheld and much cheaper. So obviously it's going to be doing much better than the PS5, but Nintendo fans have to talk about something. Now, obviously, this could mean a number of things, and various people online have been making their own assumptions. They predict that this might be a shortage or a stock issue. Well, okay, if it's a stock issue, why is it that all around the world, most people are able to get their hands on a Switch 2, even if they just gotta try a little bit? Like in comparison to a lot of things that have launched over the past 5 years, not even necessarily just consoles, various electronics, all these other stuff that have been such high in demand, it's drastically easier to get a hold of a Switch 2 as compared to other consoles. And it still is to this week. People are just being like, hey, Target's available, and then a bunch of people get it from Target. That's not how it normally is. Not in a world with scalpers. In a world with scalpers, I had a hard time getting tickets to a rainforest visit in Puerto Rico. True story. Because the tour guides in Puerto Rico would go online and they would buy the tickets first in order to make sure that if you wanted to go to the rainforest, you had to go through a tour guide and you couldn't just go by yourself. But a Switch 2, if you just follow a single Twitter page, you can get one within a day or two. Everybody is reporting that. Everybody is saying it. So how can this thing simultaneously be almost readily available, but at the same time have a shortage? That doesn't make any sense. Especially when you consider that when a shortage happens, that's when scalpers start making money. So now with these Switch 2s that are not really that available anymore, you'd think that the price of the Switch 2 online would be going up. Well, actually, it's the opposite, because it's going down in demand. You see, when the Switch 2 first launched, people were scalping it and flipping it and making roughly $100 if you consider the eBay fees. The local markets online, if you go through OfferUp or Facebook Market, were actually cheaper than buying it off eBay, but obviously you go through eBay for that extra security. Either way, the profits, and I've been keeping track of them, were roughly $100 for scalpers, usually even dropping down to $75. Now, if you look at eBay, what people are making off of this thing is less than 20, 30 bucks. Depending on how high the taxes in the city that you're living in, you might not be making anything, or rather the scalpers might not be making anything off of this. So that tells me that the demand is not really there despite the fact that it's a shortage. Because as you guys know, when there's demand for something, that's when the scalpers make the most money. Now you argue that Nintendo beat the scalpers, but scalpers have still been scalping this thing since the beginning. They just haven't been making that much money on it because Nintendo took most of the profit margins for themselves and pocketed it by overcharging for the Switch 2 already. But even then, at 450 bucks, you'd think you'd make more than $100 off this thing. But no, Nintendo did say they were going to beat the scalpers and they were going to have a ton of units available, which they don't have a ton of units available because now people are claiming there are shortages which is making scalpers come out, but the scalpers aren't making enough money. So I'm just trying to figure out what exactly is it here. At what point will you guys admit that there's not that much demand for the Switch 2? At what point are people going to accept that this thing is not going to be a blowaway success? That's what I'm wondering. I'm not saying it's going to be a failure. I'm not saying that at all. But this whole best-selling console, fastest-selling console, amazing gift from God onto this green earth. At which point are you going to agree that it's probably mid, let's say? Like, okay, we obviously all accepted fairly early on that it's not going to reach the DS numbers, the PS2 numbers, and the Switch numbers. Those are anomalies. Although a lot of people initially early on were saying that it would, but it's okay. We accepted that pretty early on. Do people out there still think it's going to be hitting the Wii and PlayStation 4 numbers, that being between 100 and 120 million? Because I don't. The PlayStation is hard to gauge. That was released in 1994, but the Wii and the PS4 were both recent enough where even in a time before online scalping, I remember vividly those consoles being significantly harder to grab than the current Nintendo Switch 2. Do you guys remember that too, or is it just me? Because I remember lining up outside of a Toys R Us a year after the Wii came out, hours prior to the store opening, and being turned away because I was not one of the first people in line. Now, I actually got my Wii on launch night at midnight, so this was me buying my second Wii. And the reason I was buying a second Wii is because my first Wii got stolen when somebody broke into our house on a sad, sad night. But that's a story for another time. But look, I've been saying this since launch night, and I've repeated it over and over and over again. The launch of the Switch 2 feels weird. The online discourse, the availability, and the sales numbers, everything is contradicting. And the reason it is so contradicting is because Nintendo stockpiled a crap ton of units early on, to the point that you'd think this thing was the most in-demand console in history. But in actuality, it wasn't. It couldn't even sell out on opening nights. It took 4 days to sell out, which I'm guessing hasn't happened in like 20 years. I'm pretty sure most consoles that come out are completely sold out on the opening weekend and don't get more units in for a few days. This thing took them 4 days to sell out, and that's if they sold out. I don't actually think they sold out. I think they just got to like a nice round number of 3.5 because they continued to sell over the next few days, didn't they? In the most recent console launches, over the span of the last, 15 years, when a console sells out, if you don't grab it on day one, you're not getting it for like a week or two. But the Switch 2 took 4 days. That is not a console that's in demand. That's a console that people are like, oh, hey, it's available, I'll go grab it. And everything around it is showing it. The fact that the sales numbers have completely withered away over the span of the past few weeks. The fact that most people that want a Switch 2 are able to get a hold of a Switch 2. And the fact that if this was a console that was in demand and was facing a shortage, the scalpers would be making a killing off of it. But it is not in demand. But there is one more possibility here. There is one more theory that I see flowing around as to why the Switch 2 could possibly see itself dropping a little bit in sales. Why the numbers haven't just skyrocketed like so many people expected. And this is what I'm seeing from the most hardcore of Nintendo fans. They believe that Nintendo could possibly be holding units now because Donkey Kong Bonanza has launched and they were waiting for the launch of Donkey Kong Bonanza so they can release more units. And in their minds, they think that Nintendo is trying to slowly sprinkle out Switch 2 unit sales to stretch it out over the span of as long as they can, while also having an impactful launch with every new game. And then potentially, once the holidays start, they release even more consoles that are already made, basically. That is what Nintendo fans have resorted to for part of their coping mechanisms. I wanted to use the word cope because I've never seen a single person use it correctly online before, so I wanted to kind of give you guys an idea of what an actual coping mechanism is. Now, Nintendo fans were pumping their chests and so proud of the fact that Nintendo was allegedly not doing a Sony, which they believed was manufacturing hype by limiting stock. And now they're saying they think that Nintendo is being smart by manufacturing hype. And I actually am fully on board with this theory. Nintendo has been manufacturing hype for the Nintendo Switch 2 from early on. Oh, they are absolutely holding back units. They are absolutely trying to convince people that this thing is selling in just giant waves of availability. And they are absolutely trying to convince people that it's the most in-demand thing in the world and that it's always out of stock. So much so that they even sent signs that said out of stock with the launch of the new console, something that's unheard of because you never want people to assume your console is out of stock. But it is a marketing ploy, and I've been saying this for over a month now. I am of the opinion that this thing didn't get nearly as many pre-orders as Nintendo wanted, outside of maybe Japan, obviously, because over there it was priced appropriately. In the West and everywhere else, they were ripping you off. But I think they were expecting significantly more. Remember, analysts and Bloomberg and everybody was reporting 6 to 8 million units would be ready for launch. And I still think that is actually true. But there were not 6 to 8 million people that wanted to buy this thing at launch. They barely got half of that. So I think they had poor pre-orders. I think they had a launch that they didn't expect would take 4 days to get to the number they were looking for so they can tweet about it. And now, just like they stockpiled and delayed the launch of the Switch 2 in order to have a whole crapload of units available at the launch of the console, to manufacture a story about having the best launch ever, they're going to do the exact same thing from now until the new year, or maybe it's going to be the holidays, whenever it's going to be, where they have a second launch. And this is a repeated discussion. I said the same thing a few weeks ago. The Switch 2 is going to have a second launch because Nintendo is going to withhold units in order to have another boom of a launch. Because Nintendo is excellent at manufacturing hype.